Well, hello and welcome everyone to this webinar being co-hosted by the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference, Education and Workforce Committee, and the Fiscal Affairs Forum. My name is Derek Cantu. I'm a policy analyst here at CSG Midwest, and I'm also the lead staffer of our Education Committee. I'm joined today by my colleague Joe Dell'Olio, who staffs our Fiscal Affairs Forum, and we're also joined by the Office Manager for CSG Midwest, Christina Luperini, who is helping to run the webinar off screen. Before we begin, I want to just first go over a few housekeeping items. So today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the various presentation materials will be available on the CSG Midwest website sometime next week. We hope that this webinar will be very engaging, and so we will dedicate some time after the first presentation and after our final presentation for you to submit your questions and relevant comments. And you can just put those into the Q&A feature that can be found at the bottom of your screen. As I previously mentioned, today's webinar is being co-hosted by two groups that make up the Midwestern Legislative Conference. You can see here the lawmakers who make up our leadership teams on those two different groups. These groups provide legislators an open forum to highlight and discuss advances in public policy. Committee-informed programming, such as this webinar, happen throughout the year, but the premier convening actually happens at our MLC annual meeting. And this year, the annual conference is being held in picturesque St. Paul, Minnesota, from August 30th to September 2nd. Early bird registration rates are actually available now through the end of the month. We hope that you'll be able to join us for 4 days of policy discussions, learning, and family-friendly fun. You can visit our website, csgmidwest.org, for more information. And then finally, another service that CSG Midwest offers is in-depth policy research analysis on interstate issues that state and provincial chambers are discussing. To help set the stage of some of the recent changes that legislatures have been making to school funding schemas, I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Joe. Joe, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Derek. Thank you to everyone who's joining us this afternoon and to our speakers. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us. Before handing things off, we just wanted to cover some of the work that's already being done within the region to directly and sometimes indirectly affect school funding from the state level. So first, we wanted to take a look at property tax reforms. First of which, Ohio HB 186, which was passed in 2025. For background into this bill, Ohio uses a 20 mil floor. Mills provide a minimum amount of local revenue each year to schools, and this bill really aims to limit the automatic increases in tax revenue due to higher property tax assessments without a levy. This bill creates a new inflation cap credit, preventing increases in school district property taxes from exceeding the rate of inflation, and also includes an appropriation from the state's tax holiday fund to ensure that districts not up for reappraisal wouldn't lose revenue compared to 2024 with this bill. South Dakota, through HB 1051 from earlier this year, does something similar, setting a maximum mill levy to $4.87 per $1,000 of taxable valuation. And I do want to say these numbers are rounded. Mills go to the thousandth, so we did round these numbers. And then also want to mention here with that, a special levy for special education would be capped at $1.44. There are also special rates for agricultural land, as well as owner-occupied single-family dwellings. And this also revises state aid definitions and calculations for both general and special education formulas. Moving on to Indiana SB 1 of 2025, this was a rather large tax reform bill. So just looking at specific elements that would touch on, that would impact potentially school funding. One, it amends the calculation and the methodology to determine the state's maximum levy growth quotient. And this will be a phased-in change. So determines the structure that phased-in change between 2026 and 2028 with an all-new calculation method starting in 2029. Also in 2029, the ad valorem property tax levy for local government units that use a previous budget, it alters the ad valorem property tax levy such that local governments would not generally be able to increase their budget from that of a previous year without affirmative action. This includes a public hearing as well as passing an ordinance. And this also does make changes to how school corporations can raise or put tax levy referendums on the ballot. These may not be placed on ballots in 2 consecutive years. Next slide, please. Next, moving to direct funding updates, Iowa SF 2201 from earlier this year establishes a 2% state supplemental aid rate, which provides pure pupil funding, resulting in about a $160 increase from the previous fiscal year, bringing state spending to about $8,100 per pupil. This also does modify the property tax replacement payments to school districts with a base of $153 per pupil, with the potential for more depending on certain criteria being met, as well as appropriates $7 million from the state general fund for the 26-27 fiscal year to supplement compensation for non-salaried education support staff. And in North Dakota, HB 1214 of 2025 structured state funding for school transportation aid. It shifts the state away from fixed block grants to a weighted per pupil system. Calculations account for large and small bus miles, number of eligible bus runs throughout the year, student utilization, the overall square miles of a school district. And then finally, states are looking to the future as well and looking at the Kansas Education Funding Task Force. The state's current school financing formula is set to expire in 2027. And so this task force is taking a look at the current funding formula and are charged with submitting a report and recommendations to the legislature and governor for new school finance formula. And this task force is made up of both legislative and non-legislative members. And then taking a look at Minnesota through HF 3900, there will be a constitutional amendment on the 2026 ballot, amending the Constitution and how the permanent school fund is invested and managed. This would change this 2.5% allocation and distribution of the fund to a larger annual payment to school districts, statutorily setting this distribution to 4.5% of the 3-year average value of the fund. So in theory, this would account for inflationary changes. Thanks y'all for letting me run through some of these updates in our region. And with that, I will hand it over to Rep. Perryman. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to all the attendees today on on this webinar. I'm going to just give you a brief overview of the agenda as we get into the thick of things. And again, thank you for being on this webinar. I think you will all agree with the number of lawmakers that are in attendance today on this webinar. I bet you can all ask and bet that any of them, one of them, they will be able to share just how complicated negotiations on state education funding can get. Pretty much every Midwestern state is facing large existential challenges to their education funding plans. A mixture of decreased birth rates and increased transitions to alternative education providers has contributed to continued declines in public school enrollment. And although the primary focus of today's discussion will be on K through 12, operational budgets, many policymakers are finding themselves figuring out in real time how to continue funding, for example, after-school programs, student mental health services, and support services for unhoused students. This is not to say that progress has not occurred. State lawmakers and policy experts have and will continue to develop interventions that are helping to close financial gaps. School district appropriation levels are being coupled with data-backed improvement and equity goals. At the end of today's webinar, we hope you will all be able to walk away with not only a better understanding of the different formulas which models states use to fund schools, but the specific strategies policymakers are debating and implementing today. I will now turn things over to our Vice Chair of the MLC Education and Workforce Committee and co-moderator of today, Representative Mary Lynn Poskin of Kansas, who will introduce our first speaker. Take it away, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Perryman. Our first presenter today is Michael Griffith, a nationally recognized consultant in school finance and a senior research fellow with the Learning Policy Institute. Over the past 20 years, he has worked with policymakers in all 50 states to help them reshape and reform their school funding system, always to improve student achievement and education equity. His research work has focused on the condition of state and district budgets, the adequacy and equity of state finance formulas, and promising practices in funding programs for high-need students. Michael holds a BA in political philosophy from Michigan State University, an MA in public administration from The Ohio State University, and an MA in education management from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Michael is here today to provide an overview of the different formulas and revenue sources states use to fund public education and highlight some of the national and regional challenges complicating future funding plans. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that nice introduction. So let me share my screen, and are you all able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through. I have about 15 to 20 minutes to walk you through everything that's going on nationally with education funding and to help you understand how that might impact your state and some of the things that you're probably looking at already and other things that you'll be looking at as the next year legislative session moves forward. So I'm going to do it by walking through some basic facts about school funding. We're going to talk briefly about formulas in general, and then a couple of emerging issues that we're really seeing move forward. Now, putting things into context, I'm going to guess most of you know this already, but state funding is the primary source nationally, just a little above local funding. So 47% of funding for K-12 public education comes from state funds, 45% from local, 8% from the federal government. That number for the federal government was as high as 15% just a couple of years ago. That's the highest it's ever been. Normally, it's around 9% or so. It doesn't sound like much when we're saying it's 8% now and it was 15% at one point. The important thing to remember is every percentage of spending in public education is equal to about $10 billion. We spend $1 trillion right now publicly for K-12 education. So small percentage changes means a huge amount of money. Those dollars were the COVID relief dollars that kind of changed everything. We'll talk about how that's kind of still working its way through the system and causing some sort of anomalies with certain numbers, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So where does the revenue come from your states? This is the state sources, the percentage that goes to K-12 revenue. You can see it varies greatly. The numbers are a little old, 24-25 school year. You're going to be hearing in a bit why the Nebraska numbers might not be matching what's currently going on. But generally, this means that the greater reliance on state sources mean you're relying more, obviously, on things like income tax and sales tax. There is no magic number. There's no research that says you should have a certain percentage coming from state funding and a certain percentage coming from local funding. Generally, we would say if you're more reliant on state funding, you're more likely to be impacted by an economic downturn because sales tax and income tax are more sort of flexible and move up and down more depending on the economy, where local funding that primarily comes from property taxes are more stable. But that's not always true because in Michigan, you see it's almost 65% comes from state funding. A large amount of that are actually statewide property tax levies. So it's a state tax, but it's still a property tax and it's still pretty stable. Showing all that, this just shows you then the local source of funding. Just as you'd expect, if you have a smaller percentage of state funds coming to pay for it, you'd have a larger percentage of local funds. So Nebraska was the lowest on the list for state source of funding. It's the highest on the list for local. Again, we're going to hear why these numbers might not be, as true in Nebraska because some changes they've made, but it gives you a general idea of where your state is at. Where does the money go? Well, the money primarily goes to staffing. So classroom instruction, so these are teacher salaries and benefits. Classroom teachers account for about 50% of all spending, and all staff, and this would include everyone from sort of the people who work in the lunchroom, janitors, counselors, nurses, superintendents, every person you can think of within a school, that accounts for 77.1% for their salaries and benefits. So it's heavily skewed towards the expenditures towards hiring people and providing them with benefits. The numbers are a little off for this because this is a 22-23 school year. There was still a large amount of COVID funding. So the COVID dollars primarily didn't go to staff hiring because they were temporary funds. They went to other things. So the numbers are a little off. What we normally see is that the classroom instruction would be closer to 55% in a standard year where there wasn't federal COVID funding in there. And then all staff would be closer to 80%. This is a map. I pulled this from the Education Commission of the states. They have a lot of good data on state funding formulas. And it shows the different types of school funding formulas that are out there. The majority of the states that are here today use what we would call student-based funding. Now, student-based funding simply is this idea that you put a dollar amount per student, and we'll talk a bit more about this, and then you make adjustments based on student needs and district and regional needs. Student-based funding is by far the largest type of funding formula. But one caution I would put here is just because two states have this type of formula, and it looks like they have something similar, they can have something very different. The formula in a place like North Dakota or Colorado or New York or California, they are all student-based, but they are all pretty different in how they operate. But it gives you a general idea. Then there's a couple of states that have their own unique type of funding formula, or they use a combination of staffing and student-based. And you have in this region, Wisconsin and Illinois fit that category. Every state I go into, there's a belief that they have the most complicated school funding system that exists. The winner is actually Wisconsin. You have the most confusing one. And it's basically a system of layered funding. It's pretty hard to even explain, but you are the winner there, if you want to call it that. The states in green have what we call staffing-based, or sometimes these are called teacher-based or position-based systems. And the idea here is that the formula provides funding to districts based on staffing models. What you say is for every, say, 25 students, we will provide you with a teaching position. For every 500 students, we'll provide you with a counselor or with a school nurse. Every school building will get a principal. That's how you structure the formula. In some cases, they're fairly rigid. So in places like Washington or West Virginia or North Carolina, when it says your district is going to get, say, 50 teaching positions, you will be hiring 50 teachers. You can't hire 49, you can't hire 51 necessarily. In some states, though, like Wyoming, the money is distributed based on a count of teaching positions or other positions, but you can spend the money however you want. It's kind of turned into cash once it goes to the districts. These types of systems, staffing-based funding, are old school systems. They were much more popular a couple of decades ago. If we would have looked at this map 20 years ago when I first started, it would be much more green. But what states have found over time is the system's too rigid for education today. That we look at more things than just staffing, and so we need to have more flexible system, and that's the student-based funding system. And some of these states that are listed here are moving away from the system. So Alabama and Delaware, starting in the next couple of years, will be moving to a hybrid system. Other states like Idaho, Virginia, North Carolina are all looking at moving to a student-based system. Um, so we really see student-based as the system as people are moving forward. So what does that mean, a student-based system? Well, you start with what's called the foundation amount, and sometimes it's called the base amount or just the per pupil amount. And this should be a number that allows your general education students to meet or exceed your state standards. And then we make adjustments for students based on their needs. So additional funding for at-risk students or English language learners or special ed. Some states have additional funding for students who are foster youth or are students experiencing homelessness or some other categories. And you also make adjustments in these formulas for things like regional costs. Where is it more expensive to hire teachers and to do business as a school district or a charter? Uh, Almost every state has an adjustment based on district size. If a district is smaller than about 1,500 kids, there is an additional cost per student because of their small size. When you start to get about 20 kids or fewer per grade in a district or school, the costs really start to ramp up. So there's additional funding adjustments that states make for that. And then there are special districts or special programs like career tech and things like that that also formulas make adjustments for. So this gets you to your total formula amount. Then you subtract out what the local contribution is, and that's what the state formula is then going to pay for. But one thing I want to touch on is this is the primary state formula that we're talking about. There are also almost always other funds for education within the state. So sometimes they're capital, transportation, or food services, but they can be for a lot of things like after school activities, summer school activities, reading programs, book purchases, all sorts of things. And what we've seen is states are moving away from those. We call those categorical funding. They all have good purposes, right? They all sound great, but what they do is add greater amount of paperwork, take away greater amounts of freedom from school districts. So we've seen states more and more moving away from those. And California is sort of the poster child for this. At one point, they had about 90 different smaller categorical programs, and they got rid of almost all of them, took those funds and put them into the primary formula, and gave greater freedom to school districts, much less paperwork, allowed districts to be more focused. But making that trade with districts and charters, they required them to report how they were going to use the additional money and the additional freedom and funding to get their students at or above state standards. So it was these educational agreements. So that's something you might think of in your own state, that maybe collapsing some of these programs and providing greater freedom to school districts can really help your students. So now I want to talk about some of the big issues that are out there. One is, and this has just been going on since I started in this, it's inflation. Every year you've got to provide additional funding because teacher salaries go up, staff benefits go up, you have things out of your control like energy cost, you have health care that you need to provide to your employees, and you have no control over healthcare costs, right? So every year you need to look at providing additional funding just to be sort of at a break-even point. Inflation kind of, is a bigger or smaller factor at all times, but it has always been disproportionate on schools because of the cost of benefits and because schools can't control that. Another big issue is federal funding. The COVID funds are kind of long gone at this point. Those were additional dollars that helped schools kind of get past the impact of COVID. What we're seeing now, though, is pretty much flat funding. Sorry, one second. Flat funding for federal dollars. There's talk of possible decreases in federal spending, but quite honestly, everything we've been kind of hearing is flat funding for federal dollars moving forward. So there isn't going to be any sort of additional new federal money coming in, but at least there aren't going to be any large cuts as we kind of move forward. Something, and this was mentioned a little earlier, that is a huge issue and something we're focusing in on a lot at LPI is the declining student enrollment that is happening. Between 2019 2024, we saw a loss of 1.4 million students in public education. That's 2.8%. We're seeing this decrease primarily because of demographics. We've seen some small movement towards private schools, and then a movement of students that aren't accounted for. Most people believe those students have gone to some form of homeschooling, although it's very difficult to tell for sure. Um, we've seen this pattern going on for decades now, especially in rural areas that have seen a slow loss of students and in some larger urban areas. But what we're seeing now is it's across the board in states. We're also seeing it in states that we would have never thought we'd see it in. I was in a meeting 2 weeks ago in Utah, who has been the poster child for student growth for the last 50 years, for the first time is looking at decreased student enrollment. That really tells you something. That's a canary in the coal mine to tell you there are massive changes happening. Um, Also in there is that we have fewer students immigrating into our system. We have had the demographic issue and the birth rate issue for a long time, since about 2008. We know it's an impact, but we didn't see the declines in student enrollment because we had an increasing number of students who were immigrating into our system from other countries. Now that that is not happening, and the demographic issue is there, that's why we're seeing even greater decreases. Why is this an issue? Well, at the state level, people will argue that it's not an issue. We have fewer kids, so we can spend the same amount. That just means we'll spend more per student. I think there are a lot of arguments kind of against that or for that, but it's something that you're hearing from places, but it's a real impact on school districts and charter schools because they have fixed cost. You've got to heat the building, you've got to clean the building, you've got all the cost of transportation. A school bus costs what it costs if there are three fewer kids on it or not. What we've seen in research is that it takes about 3 years to right size a school district when they lose students. But if you're always losing students, you're always in this process of right sizing. So, it's been a big issue and it's something that is impacting a lot of different districts. One of the things I keep an eye for in your state too is suburban districts who have never dealt with this before are starting to deal with this. So maybe coming up with something within your state to help districts think about this and come up with a plan. Um, so these are my cheat codes that I'll give you. That when we talk about improving student achievement, which is incredibly important, I hear this over and over that student test scores aren't going up, and that's a huge issue. Um, it's important just to realize if you want to move student achievement scores, test scores, graduation rates, college going rates, any of that, the best way to do it is focus funding on high need student groups. So those are English language learners, at-risk students, and special education students. The reason being is our education system does a really good job actually with general ed students. And our general ed students, those are students that don't need any additional supports. They tend to score well on tests. They tend to have really high graduation rates within 4 years. They tend to move on to jobs or additional schooling right after high school. But so if you want to move your numbers in your state, it's focusing on those other students, the high need students. Um, so we talk about looking more at something like expenditures and not revenues. The revenue numbers, especially when you look at the COVID year numbers, are really kind of skewed because those dollars came in and were spent over a long period of time. I would look more at expenditures over time to see when you're looking at the last 5 years or so and want to make comparisons. Um, and we can just tell you the public is very supportive of increasing teacher salaries and any other supports for teachers or other positions within schools. They are very supportive in general of high need students. people get that, especially when we talk about groups of students like special education students. So putting additional funding there and additional supports can be not only good for the students, but seen to be very supported by the public. And they like programs, funding programs that can be measured one way or the other. People really like small class size, but things like extended learning, increased food security, things that you can say we put 10 million more into education in our state and it's going for this purpose. So that tends to be much more supported than just general funding increases. So that's the end of my formal presentation. If you have any questions, there's my email address. One thing I will tell you, I'm actually retiring at the end of this month. So if you've got a question for me, you have like 15 days to do it. And, but I'd love to get those if you send them within the next 15 days. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and I'll stop sharing at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. At this point, we are going to open up for questions for about 5 to 7 minutes. And I do want to remind folks that we are going to have a larger question and answer period a little bit later in the webinar. So I will open it up. Do we see anybody? Derek, I can't see if there's any raised hands. Are you able to see that? Oh, I
Yes,
see.
yeah, I did see one. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Oh, yeah, we do have one question, which is how are states supporting funding for infrastructure needs?
It's a really good question and a tough one because the infrastructure needs primarily fall on school districts. And most states provide a little additional help for that, and so a match usually based on the wealth of the school district. But what you don't see is where states kind of jump in and take over funding all of this. There are exceptions. Arizona did it for several years under a court order. Wyoming does it again because of court order. Washington State has a fairly generous system that was also court ordered. But it's difficult for states to jump in because of the high cost. And because you run into this situation where some school districts have a very high level of need because they haven't been paying for it themselves. Where other districts spent their own money and raised local funds to shape up their schools. And so we see this happen in states when a new program comes on. Some districts say, hey, that's not fair. We had to build ours by ourselves and pay for it ourselves. And now you're creating this program that funds other schools. So unfortunately, yeah, it's a difficult situation and not one I can give you an easy answer for.
Thank you. Any other questions at this point?
We got one
Not.
more. The question
Oh,
is,
sure.
can you give us some data sources for the argument that funding high need student groups is the best way to close achievement gaps? And there was a commentary. I worry that my state sees at-risk dollars as a pot of money to just raid and tie to achievement, but also to be punitive if they fall short.
I have some of those sources. I will send it to CSG staff and then they can distribute it to all of you. Some that my own organization, the Learning Policy Institute, has worked on, but there's some other good sources that are out there too. And there's a really good study in California that shows that the additional money that was put into the system when they changed their formula, they targeted that towards at-risk kids, and they did see really good improvement there for students.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And please do provide that resource. We had a presentation in our K-12 budget committee that said the opposite a year or two ago. So that would be very helpful for us in Kansas. We're going to move on and turn the show over to Representative Perryman to introduce our next guest speaker.
Well, thank you, Representative. I appreciate the turnover. We have heard about state funding in the abstract, so let's now hear about it in practice. Our next two presenters are sitting state lawmakers who are also members of legislatively created commissions tasked with evaluating and proposing changes to their respective states' funding formulas. We will first hear from Senator Jana Hughes of Nebraska. Senator Hughes grew up on a family farm near Goner, Nebraska. I have practiced at several times, Goner, Nebraska, where she learned the value of hard work and self-reliance. She attended Texas A&M University, where she majored in industrial engineering. Upon graduation, she worked as a consulting engineer in Atlanta, Georgia, before returning to Nebraska. After serving on her local school board and earning a substitute teaching certificate, Jana was elected to Nebraska unicameral legislature in 2022. She serves on the Natural Resources Committee, is the vice chair of the Education Committee and chair of the Building and Maintenance Committee, as well as a member of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact and the Education Commissioner of States. Finally, Jana serves as the co-chair of the MLC Education and Workforce Committee. She is here to talk about some of the discussions taking place on the Nebraska School Financing Review Commission. Senator Hughes, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Representative Perryman. And I'm so surprised you don't know Goner, Nebraska. I believe right now the population's about 159 people. So shocking. It is an exit off the Interstate 80 if you're driving through. So I appreciate the time today to talk about Nebraska school funding. I am up to here in school funding and in a great way. It is something that does need to be looked at, and Michael had. I hated seeing us on the lowest of the list for state funding and the highest on local, which is what it was. We have done some things to change that, and I'll kind of mention why we're not getting credit for that, so to speak. But just a little background. School funding in Nebraska is done. Our school funding formula is called TIOZA. It's a little bit of a mouthful. It was established in 1990. It's the Tax Equity and Educational Opportunities Support Act. And it is student-based, as he'd mentioned, our state does. But the basic concept is it calculates needs of a district, and that the needs are based on your basic funding per student, poverty, English language learner, transportation. We have districts in Nebraska. We have wide open prairie range and those, have high transportation costs, low number of kids, et cetera. But it looks at the needs of a district, calculates that, and then it looks at the resources of a district. And that difference, needs minus resources, is the state support, which we call equalization aid. And when this went into play, we had over 300 districts, and well over 300 were equalized, meaning they were receiving that state funding to kind of make up that difference from the local resources. Today we have 245 school districts in the state, and we have between 50 and 60 that are equalized. And basically what's happened over the last 25, 30 years, our resources is just basically the valuation of a district. So the valuation of the farm ground, the homes, the commercial businesses. And we are a market-based state is on how we do valuations. So as valuations rose, as they do, it showed that the local district had the resources to cover their local school. And so as valuations were rising, nothing was changed in the formula to keep state aid going out. And so as valuations rose, fewer and fewer schools were equalized. And now it's come to head, and I know other states are dealing with this, but the people are rebelling because so many schools are just a lot on property tax and feeling, and then the state mandates things and they're like, what the heck? You're not even giving us a penny. So why, so it's that whole issue. When TIOZA was formulated, they were supposed to have a commission that would look at that. It should be a living, breathing formula. And that commission was supposed to kind of watch it. It was established for 1 year and then dissolved. And so last year I had brought a bill, and we actually it had other things in it, but we got the commission part passed. So we established the Education Finance Commission, and that group meets quarterly. We just started last fall. We just got it into play last summer. So we had 4 meetings quick in the fall, and then now we're doing our regular quarterly meetings during the year. But it's 18 members, and our sole focus is school funding. And shout out to CSG. I reached out to them and when I wanted poverty information from other states. And so we were able to get some of that, using CSG as a research mechanism to give us that information. So the goal of this commission is to evaluate, one, within TIOSA, the specific needs and resources components, and then recommend adjustments back to the legislature to minimize either state funding going away, minimize big swings between districts, and to take the time to look at what other states are doing, comparing to what we're doing, and try to, get best practices here. Our first year was kind of just that shortfall, and we wanted to establish a baseline where we're at. And these are some of the numbers that we had. So in 2019, 2020, it really matched what we were 56% of all Nebraska schools were locally, 56% of the money came from local, and 38% came from state. 2024, 25, we have really flipped the script, and 38% are local, is from local funds, and 53% of state funds. However, this is my warning to anybody, we do not ever show on any mechanism that we have done anything to help our schools state funding wise, because we mostly do it in the form of a tax credit. And so it was started before I was even in the body, but they started a tax credit system where you would pay your property tax, and then they did an income tax credit. So then when you filed your income tax for Nebraska, you could deduct 30% of what you'd paid towards school, or it wasn't 30% at the start, it is today, but an amount that you'd paid towards schools, you could deduct off your income tax. So when you do a form of a tax credit, when entities analyze what states are spending on schools, the credits don't get credit. Does that make sense? So they don't look at that credit coming back as state funding. They just look at the tax ask from these entities. And so we still show when they look at us as the United States, Nebraska is like the sixth highest property tax asking state in the nation, even though we're really not, because when you count our tax credits, we're more in the 20s. So it's been good. It's just been frustrating because we kind of don't get credit for it. A couple years ago, instead of doing an income tax credit, we actually do a property tax credit. So it shows directly on the statement. It'll show that the school, let's say, asked for $5,000 and the tax credit is $1,500. And then your bill to pay is that difference, if that makes sense. So prior to when you filed as an income tax, that was kind of a sneaky way to help the state, because not every person would do that income tax credit, right? And not take advantage of it. So it saved the state money. Now it is directly on your property tax bill. And so everybody does get the credit of the property tax credits. The other thing that we have done to help school funding, and I think the most beneficial thing that Nebraska did, is we put money towards special ed funding, and it's a direct link. We will pay up to 80% of what special ed needs are. So and it's by district, and it is a year in arrears, but what your true special ed costs are, the feds pay a small amount, but then the Nebraska state will come in and pay that difference. That's been very helpful for our very, very small. Nebraska is interesting in that our biggest school district is Omaha Public Schools. It's over 60,000 students. And our smallest district is McPherson County, which the county itself has 300 people. So the school has like 28 kids, K through 12. And it's out west. It's a big county. It's not much merging potential there. So you've got this TIOSA system that's trying to do this for that size up to a massive school. What was nice about the special ed funding is when you've got some of these smaller rural school districts, you get one or two high needs kiddos in there, that need a lot of services, maybe a full-time nurse, et cetera, that could really throw their budget off a lot when it's just that much smaller budget. So the special ed funding, I think, has been very beneficial to schools. Um, so now we're in our second year of our Education Finance Commission, and this is where the rubber meets the road. We have been meeting, we broke the commission into two committees, and I am on the committee to evaluate the components of TIOZA. The other half are evaluating spending. What are expenditures in schools? Is there ways that we can, what can we eliminate? Can we, what have we required that we don't need to, et cetera? What my committee is doing is going through each actual piece of the TIOZA component and just deep diving. We have spent an eternity on poverty, how we pay for what our poverty allowance is. And I mean, months. Which are just the sheets of paper, kiddos fill out or families fill out for free and reduced lunch. We had a 4-tier system that was every tier higher. You got a little bit bigger chunk of like the basic funding amount. I think we had 8 or 9 different iterations that we came up with. We're not there yet, but I believe we're going to be recommending going to a direct certification route, which is an actual number. You can get it off HHS. It's families that are in Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, things like that. Other states, I think, are going that route for the most part. The nice thing, it's auditable. You don't have the issue of, this family could get the services, but they just refuse to fill out the free and reduced lunch sheet, things like that. I think we're going to still recommend a 4-tier model. And then what we did is the models we thought we'd like, we reverse engineered them to see what the effects were over the last 10 years and how that would affect schools. And so that's been really interesting. The other big one we spent some time on is our English language learner. Right now, we just did a 20%, 25% of the basic funding for the kiddos that were ELL kids. But I think we're going to go maybe toward a 2-tier model. We have some schools that are over 49% English language learner. And, when you've got that much higher, it is a higher cost. So I think we're going to look at a 2-tier model then. We've actually eliminated some pieces of it. Of the TIOZA model, we had a distance ed piece that was put in 30 years ago that just doesn't qualify anymore. So we are just trying to update what we're doing and clean it up. And I think we're going to be very successful in doing so. So it's been kind of fun, and it's been interesting to see what other states do and make comparisons and help us out. So anyway, thank you for having me. My biggest point is when you consider property tax relief, the tax credit, it does relief, but it doesn't, I don't know. You're not getting credit for the tax credits. And honestly, people don't see it as much, if that makes any sense. I want to take those, I've brought bills every year, take those tax credits and buy down the levies. Still going to be trying to do that so that the tax asking is less versus you ask for this much and you backfill. That seems kind of silly. So thanks for having me, and I'd appreciate any questions at the end when we're done. So,
thank you, Senator Hughes, for that update from Nebraska, where I spent 6 years in Bellevue Public Schools.
Very good. Very good.
So next, we will hear from Senator Kimberly Lightford of Illinois. She has served in the Illinois Senate since 1998 and is the first Black woman to have served as the Illinois Senate Majority Leader. During her tenure, Leader Lightford started the state's universal preschool for all program, established no bullying zones on school playgrounds, and reformed disciplinary practices that were disproportionately affecting at-risk and minority students. She has also been involved in expanding access to school meal programs and helped to implement easier pathways for high school dropouts to be able to re-enroll in school. Kimberly holds a bachelor's degree in public communications from Western Illinois University and a Master of Public Administration degree from the University of Illinois at Springfield. She's here to talk about the progress Illinois schools have made since the state adopted a new school funding formula in 2017 and summarize some of the discussions that have taken place within the group tasked with regularly reviewing the new formula. Senator Lightford, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to join my colleagues and experts who share a deep commitment to making sure every child, no matter where they live, no matter their zip code, has access to a quality public education. So I want to start by saying school funding is a value statement. That's how I viewed it in the state of Illinois. I saw it as states decides to fund its public schools. It'll tell you exactly what they feel, what they believe about children, about the opportunities that exist for those kids, and about its own future. And as I listened to Senator Hughes from Nebraska, I just felt her from years ago when I pushed this effort for years and years and years until we finally nailed it. And it has proven to be very, very beneficial and helpful to the school system overall. But right now, a lot of those values are being tested across the Midwest and across the country. State legislators are navigating a genuinely difficult moment because of the fiscal uncertainty of the revenues. It's really harder to predict what that federal support is. That shift of Title I funds on the city of Chicago, which is one of the largest school districts in the country, it really impacts the revenue. And we're feeling those budget pressures. So every dollar has a competitive nature as to how much money of new dollars created should go into our funding formula. And at the same time, public schools enrollment is declining in many of our communities as a result. Families are making different choices and demographics are significantly shifting in the state. The changes that are coming out of the U.S. Department of Education, they're just adding another layer of complexity that every state is trying to interpret and to figure out and to respond to. So none of this is simple for any of us, even if we've had the formula on the books for many years. So I want to be honest about that because I think the worst thing we can do is pretend that these are easy problems that have easy answers. So I'm here with all of you in the middle of this complexity. There has been a renewed and serious conversation about equity, about whether our funding formulas, many of which were designed decades ago, still serve the students that we have today. And so about whether or not we are actually delivering on the promise that where you live should not determine the quality of your education. That is the conversation that we're in right now after passing this funding formula in 2017. So we're about, 9 years in. And so I'm glad that we're here having this conversation today because although we had some success, it's shifting and changing as our revenues change. So in Illinois, we have been on a journey with school funding reform. For years, for decades, honestly, we had the most inequitable school funding system in the nation. It was totally embarrassing. Everywhere I went, we were the bottom of the total poll, ranked 48, 49, 50th in funding and in every other category. We were very heavily relying on local property taxes, which meant wealthy communities had well-resourced schools and low-income communities were left behind. The formula wasn't working for kids, and it surely wasn't working depending on what zip code you lived in. And so when we passed the evidence-based funding model for student success, it was called the Evidence-Based Funding for Student Success Act. We were told it was landmark legislation that fundamentally restructured how we fund our schools. And I'm hoping that that's what the nation saw because at its core, the new formula did build around the idea that we should first determine what it actually costs to give every student an adequate education and then fund towards that target. The formula accounts for student characteristics, for poverty, for English language learners, special education needs, and it directs new dollars to the districts that are furthest from adequacy first. So when I heard Michael speaking, I was really glad to know that we were still doing the right thing. It was totally not easy. It took years of work, hard negotiations, and a willingness from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to put students ahead of politics. We did get it passed, and it made a real difference. I tell you that story not to suggest that in Illinois we have all the answers, because we surely don't, but we are still years away from fully funding our adequacy target. So it does take some time. And we face the same pressures that every state here faces. But but I share it because it demonstrates that reform is possible, even when the politics are hard. And as you think about your own state's conversation, I want to lift up a few questions that I believe every state has to wrestle with. I know you ask me questions, but I'm also here trying to get some answers as well. And so I think my first question is, I think to ask this question is, what does adequacy actually mean in your state? I got to tell you all, it took about 3 months for us to just agree on a definition of adequacy. And so I asked that question because once that relationship is built and the understanding is there, we began to really, it shifted our conversation and we began to work together more as a team. And so once we understood what that meant to all of us, we were able to build a fair funding formula with that definition being our ground. And it was grounded in evidence, not it was politically comfortable. We had to, whether we agreed with it or not, we had to seek the experts, get the information, understand, and actually from both sides, because you can have some information and I could have some information and it could be very different. And so we had to do it an awful lot of fact finding and then come up with what we all agreed on. And so my second question would be, who are your students and what do they need? So the formula for us, we wanted to treat every student identically, and it's not an equitable formula if you do not. Students experiencing poverty, students who are needing help with learning English or they have disabilities, they require more support. Whether we like that or not, it's just the truth of the matter is they just require more support. So in that funding formula, there's an added point system there for revenues. And that comes out in our targets. So funding should reflect the reality of what your students' needs are. And third, what is the role of local revenue? And how do you account for capacity? So when we think about property taxes, and they're still a significant driver of school funding in most of our states. So the question is whether your formula and our formula accounts for differences in local wealth and capacity, or whether it's just layers, state dollars on top of existing inequities. So we got to a point, you can't just keep putting money on the problem without identifying what the problem really is and how to get to the root of it. And property taxes sure weighs heavily in this space. And then I do have a fourth, and that is, how do you hold yourself accountable as the legislator? A formula is only as good as it's implemented, right? And so it was so important to make sure that the transparency was there, that the data was there, that we had honest conversations about whether the money is actually reaching students in the way it was intended. And so that's where we are now today after having this formula for almost a decade. Is it really doing what we thought it should, 9 years ago? There's different legislators, there's different players, but every year we're putting this $300 million to $350 million into the formula of new revenue, and then 50 million is specifically for the property tax relief. So I think in closing here, I just want to reflect the most difficult, important, I think, issue that we're facing is federal policy and the way it's changing ways that we create a real change, and it's creating uncertainties for us and for our school districts because as those revenues we lose from the federal government, we've got to fill these holes. And we already know we're about $3 billion in debt of our next fiscal year. And so we're thinking, how do we continue to fund our funding formula at $350 million new dollars if we're experiencing such a huge shortfall? Um, and so I think I would say that uncertainty is also creating an opportunity for us because it's making us come back to the table and take that hard look at our formula, at our revenue sources, at all of our assumptions, and ask whether they are still serving our students today like they were 9 years ago, or if there's a chance to make significant changes. We would need to listen to the communities that have historically been underserved and to take seriously what they are telling us. And so I'm looking forward to the insight in adding those measures that Mike spoke about and other presenters today, because this is exactly the kind of evidence-based cross-state conversation I believe that makes all of us better legislators. And so I thank you for allowing me to be here. And if I didn't answer your question, just ask me one more time and I'll see.
Uh,
I can
Thank you so very much, Senator Lightford. That is really great insight from the state of Illinois. I do see two questions in the Q&A that I will just start with because I know we were running out of time. One would be, have any of your decisions caused those smaller districts voluntarily to consolidate in a noteworthy way? And I think that would be open to both Senator Lightford and Hughes.
Actually, it hasn't caused us to consolidate, but we do support consolidation if it's going to help the schools in their revenue stream. Some of them share purchasing supplies and inventory and things of that nature that helps them reduce the cost from their budgets. So it wasn't a direct hit, but it was a helpful hit, if you will. We have 4 targets. We have tiers, tiers 1 through 4. And the first tier, of course, is those that are furthest from adequacy target. And tier 4 is those that are the closest to adequacy target. So connecting with that district next to you, you may be a tier 1 school and they could possibly be a tier 3 school. And so, or a tier 4. So it just depends on the benefit for both the school districts.
Senator
So,
Hughes, you had mentioned, oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yes. So to answer from Nebraska standpoint, I would say it has not had specific a direct correlation by any consolidation. I do know that I don't even want to call it consolidation. It's sharing efficiencies. It's sharing efficiencies with school districts. Kind of what Miss Kimberly said. Sharing potential administration if you're close district, et cetera. We have an issue in Nebraska. We kind of have pretty big levy disparities in that when you look at these levy disparities, really what it comes down to statistically is the lower valuation per student, the higher the levy, even though that school is getting even more state funding. And so we're kind of trying to tackle that because until you can get levies a little closer together, neighboring districts won't even, it would be stupid to consolidate. It's an economic disadvantage. If you have a lower levy, I mean, if it's 40 cents lower, why would you ever merge with a school beside you? You're going to increase your property taxes. I mean, it makes no sense. So that's kind of a phase 2 that we're hoping if we can get levies a little closer together, then we can start having this talk of sharing efficiencies and you've eliminated the financial disadvantage to a merge or a consolidation. And so we're hoping we see that in the next, few years once we kind of get things hopefully straightened out here.
Well, thank you. And I know we're running just a little bit over time, but I do want to ask Laura Vargason's question real quickly before we wrap up. She asks, are you seeing an increase in early childhood education funding or status quo outside of the impacts of declining enrollment?
In Illinois, we have seen significant increases. It's one of our targeted areas. We just created a whole department. We now officially have a department on early childhood education. I carried that initiative 2 years ago, and so we're still building it out. And it's so beneficial when we previously had areas that you would have to go to the State Board of Ed to find, or you'd have to go to the Department of Human Services, or you have to go to the Department of Children and Family Services. And so having this all under one umbrella umbrella has shown to prove to be a huge benefit to families and children and to the legislature.
Oh, thank you. Anything to add, Senator Hughes?
I don't have anything specific to add too much. It's interesting. Our formula counts like a 4-year-old as a 0.6 of a kid, I think is how it goes, because they're not there all day, whatever. And we don't even count 3-year-olds. So that is maybe a little bit of an issue on our end, and agree that the sooner you can get services to those kids, they just do better when they hit kindergarten. So that is something we're looking at, but not something specific as of yet. So.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers and all of the attendees for coming to the webinar this afternoon. Clearly, this is a very important topic that the states are tackling all over the place. And I also want to give a shout out to our CSG staff. And I do want to remind everybody that a recording of today's webinar and copies of the speaker's slides will be posted on the MLC website. Thanks, everybody, and the webinar is adjourned.
Thank you.